Dennis Young here, Primitive Substance Channel, and all the way from France, a special guest, Rhys Chatham, and pioneer, composer, recording artist, you name it. Rhys, thank you for doing this.
Dennis, thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
All right, great. So let's start with your early career, your early life, how you got interested in music.
Well, my parents were beatniks, and they arrived on the scene in the 50s in Greenwich Village, and I came along. And so I grew up, I was born and raised in Manhattan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And, but then we moved out to Long Island near Rockville Center, of all places.
Oh my gosh.
And yeah.
How about that?
And yeah. And my father was a harpsichord player. And so we had early music in the house all the time. We would listen to Stravinsky every once in a while, but
Right.
mostly it was like uh, John Dowland or Giles Farnaby and
Hmm.
or Peratine or Leonine and composers like that.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
started on clarinet,
Oh,
and because the school I went to had a music program and an orchestra, and so I was playing clarinet at 8. And my father, there was a keyboard in the house, so I was playing keyboard also. But then my father couldn't stand living on Long Island.
oh
We were
man.
there because my mother thought it would be good for me to have trees, and so we moved back to Manhattan when I was, I don't know, 9. And the elementary school I went to, PS40, was great, but
Hmm.
very good academic school, but there was no orchestra.
Okay.
So I quit for a while. But then in 1963, I saw the Ed Sullivan Show, and I
Right.
saw this group called the Beatles.
Of course.
And I said, Mom, Dad,
Yeah.
I want to be like Ringo.
There you go.
And and uh, and they were both horrified, of course, because we lived in a, a 5-room, fifth floor walk up apartment
How
in
about that?
Manhattan. And they said, well, uh, drums are very, very nice. It's a beautiful instrument. But, Reese, flute.
Flute.
Flute has a much wider repertory. And there's so many more things you can play with it. Now, it's so
Right.
stupid. I listened to them. And so I ended up playing flute. And
Oh, okay.
fortunately, the junior high school I went to, junior high school 104, had a great music program. And we did music 3 times a week. I majored
Oh,
in
that's
music
great.
there. And then I went to this wonderful school called Third Street Music School, which is still in existence today, although
Okay.
it's no longer on Third
Okay.
Street. But in the early 60s when I was there, it was on Third Street. And I ran into this, I lucked out and got a young teacher named Miss Sue-Ann Khan, uh, who became my flute teacher. And on the record player, I had heard this interesting composer named Edgar Varese, who had this piece called Density 21.5. That was, I mean,
Oh,
for
okay.
every flutist, it's their introduction into contemporary music. And so I asked Miss Khan if she could teach it to me. And fortunately for me, she was a specialist in contemporary music.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, and uh, and in fact, a couple of weeks after I took a lesson with her, she was giving a concert at Carnegie Recital Hall, playing pieces by Varese, the Sonatine for Flute and Piano by Pierre Boulez, a piece she commissioned from Stefan Volpe, a very well-known
Hmm.
uh, uh, composer from Chicago.
Right.
Um, and so I learned that was my introduction to contemporary music,
Wow, that's really
and
great.
I fell in love with the genre, and my parents were very supportive of that. I mean, they were into early music, but they liked what in France we call it musique contemporaine, which means music coming out of a European classical
Right.
background. And so then I asked my teacher if she'd teach me how to play the Boulez sonatine for flute and piano. And she said, when we were studying Bach, she would play the piano part. So she was a lot of fun to study with because it was very musical, taking lessons with her. But she said, Rhys, she didn't say it exactly like this, but she said, I'll teach you the flute part, but it's not me who's going to play the piano because it's wickedly, wickedly difficult. But fortunately, my father was friends with the keyboard player from the New York Philharmonic, whose name was Paul Jacobs, may he rest in peace. And he was able to play the Boulez.
Oh, wow.
And so he offered to sight read it with me. And so I got to play the sonatine for flute and piano with Pierre Boulez. And so that was my introduction through the Varese piece and the Boulez. I fell in love with Stockhausen.
Oh, yeah.
He had this piece called, what was it called? It had a woodwind quintet that had a flute part that I really liked. And, and I liked his other music. And then, of course, there was the famous piece by Varese called Poème électronique. And that was the granddaddy of electronic music, made for the World's Fair in Belgium in 1958. It was this beautiful electronic music piece. And I said, wow, I was getting interested in composition. And at 3rd Street, we had these great theory teachers named Tom Manoff and Donald Stratton, who got us into composition. And Donald Stratton would take all the theory students and make us form an ensemble with our instruments and said, write a piece, for this instrumentation. And so that's how I got into actual composition. And but I really liked I heard this piece by Cage called Fontana Mix, and it was just very, very noisy kind of piece.
Right.
And so I heard that and said, oh boy, I'd really like to do electronic music. It sounds really interesting. And Switched on Bach had just come out
that's a great record
by Walter Carlos, who's now Wendy Carlos, of course. And I read a very interesting article in the Sunday Times by a composer who did electronic music named Morton Subotnick. And he had just put out a record on None Such Records called Silver Apples of the Moon. And so this was a departure from the Moog, which the Moog synthesizer was basically a keyboard that was an electronic keyboard that used equal temperament, standard tuning, which enabled Mr. Carlos to play Switched on Bach. But Morton's idea, and the inventor of the Buchla synthesizer, was to use a non-tempered scale, which means getting all those pitches in between the 12 tones of the diatonic scale. And so I ran out to try to get his record. I went to Sam Goody's and it wasn't there. And, I keep going back, and finally it was there. And I drove my parents crazy playing the vinyl. And, and then, as luck would have it, at 3rd Street Music School in the theory department, Morton was interested in Morton Subotnick and working with younger people.
Oh, wow.
He thought that he could teach young. This was 1967, 1968.
Oh, wow. Right? That's really something.
And so he wanted to see if he could teach electronic music to people of that age. And so they bussed us over to New York University, where he was teaching in the intermediate program that they had there at the School of the Arts. And we had weekly sessions, and every session we would do a different parameter of music. So one time it was rhythm. So he introduced us to the sequencer because that's
Mm,
about rhythm, or maybe the parameter of envelope, the getting louder, the duration, and then the getting softer, the crescendo and the decrescendo. And that introduced us to the electronic music instrument called the gate. And in this
mm,
way, he introduced us to the synthesizer. And then at the end, of
mm.
about 15 sessions or 16 sessions or so, he had each one of us compose a 1 minute piece for the
Oh,
vocal
wow. That's
synthesizer.
something.
And
Wow.
he's so generous, and he took us individually, and we went over, made our pieces, and which we premiered at Town Hall at the annual Third Street Music
Oh,
School
how about that?
gala.
Wow.
And but I wanted to continue studying with Morton Subotnick, and so I asked him during a quiet moment, Mr. Subotnick, would it be possible to study with you? And
Mm,
so he was uh, able to. I took counterpoint. He said, "You don't need harmony. You need counterpoint. Lots and lots of counterpoint." So we
mm.
did counterpoint, and he had a little room where he put bits and pieces of the Buchla synthesizer that he wasn't using,
Oh,
and he let me work on it on weekends. So I was in heaven. What
that
was
is
I,
that's amazing.
17 years old or
Wow.
something like that? And but in this little room, uh, I saw ladies' undergarments and clothing hung up very neatly on the wall, and I was wondering,
Mm.
gee, is somebody living in here? And it turned out it was the composer Marianne Amichet,
Oh,
uh,
wow.
who uh, was sort of crashing there and also working on that synthesizer. And upstairs from there was the inventor of the Surge synthesizer, Serge Cherepnin,
Man.
who became my electronics teacher, uh,
Oh,
and later on. And so it was while working in Morton's studio that I met Charlemagne Palestine.
mm.
He opened up his studio to composers because composers, most of them couldn't afford a synthesizer back then. I don't know, they were very expensive. And
Right.
the Buchla synthesizer continues to be expensive.
Of course.
So anyway, uh, I was the junior member of the
How
Composers
about
Club,
that?
and through that I met Serge, I met Charlemagne Palestine, Ingram Marshall, Marianne Amichet, of course, and
Right.
later on the composers Laurie Spiegel and Eliane Radic, a French composer,
Right.
and
Wow.
Eliane took
Amazing.
me under her wing and brought me to her loft and played me her music, her very early music, which is of long duration and minimalist in nature.
Mm.
And I just fell in love with it. And between Eliane and Charlemagne, this was my introduction to music of long duration.
Wow.
And because before I was composing, you study. If you're a trumpet player, you're going to sound like Miles, right?
Right.
If you're
Right. Of course.
studying jazz, and you got to eventually find your own voice. Or, if you're a guitar player, you want to sound like Tony Iommi, well,
Right.
depending on what genre of music you're interested in, or Zappa or
Right.
whoever. But eventually we have to find our own voice. So I, of course, imitated Morton Subotnick when I was a teenager, and I was writing music that sounded a little bit like this. Kind of like that. Yes, very sequencer oriented. But when I heard Charlemagne's music and Eliane's music, I said, "Wow, this is more for me," and so I got into that,
Mm.
and so they were doing music of long duration, so I did music of long duration too, And Charlemagne and I would, you know, who Charlemagne Palestine is,
Yes,
right?
I've heard of them.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, right. Yeah, he's originally doing electronic music, but he's particularly known for playing the Bosendorfer piano and with this piece called strumming music,
Mm.
which it's just one chord, but you're listening to the overtones that come out of that chord, the piano, and it
Oh,
sounds
right.
like choirs and choirs
Oh,
of
wow.
angels, and
Wow. Gotta hear
very,
that.
very beautiful. And
Mm.
so I was influenced by all this music, and even on piano, working in a bar at a time, 2 bars up from CBGB's,
Oh, wow. How about that?
called Sabasics, and they had a piano there, and so I would play strumming music because it was easy to play, and because so you know, I was aping my big brother,
Oh,
Charlemagne
okay.
Palestine, right? And
Yeah.
uh,
Mm.
but then I became the music director of the kitchen. Now I'll segue into that. So there was
Sure.
NYU,
Right.
and while I was working at NYU, I was working with a choreographer named Daniel Nagrin, who every Saturday would have jam sessions with his company and invite various musicians. And I was a resident musician, so I got to work with all the musicians he would invite. And one Saturday, the Slavic kind of couple came,
Right.
named Woody and Stana Veselka. And Woody was from Czechoslovakia and Stana was from Iceland.
Mm.
And I didn't know anything about them. Woody had a Putney synthesizer that he was playing, and Stana was playing viola or something like that. But it turned out that they were one of the very, very first electronic image artists.
Oh,
They were
wow.
video artists with a big, big loft on 14th Street right near Union Square. And they were at Max's Kansas City when it was dominated by Andy Warhol, and they were part of that whole crowd. And the Portapak, the Sony Portapak camera had just come out, and making it affordable for artists to start working with electronic image, because before, to have a
Mm.
camera to go on television was thousands of dollars. When the
Right.
Portapak came out, it was like maybe $800,
Mm.
which was doable.
Right.
And so people like Woody and Stana Veselka, Bill and Louise Etra, uh, uh, and I'm having in French
Right.
we say trou de mémoire. There are many others that were Namjoon Pai, that were Kit Fitzgerald and John Sanborn. There's some other really famous names that I'm forgetting,
That's
but they
okay.
were showing their electronic image pieces that they would make on Portapaks, and
Mm.
feedback things and making interesting patterns. And um, Bill and Louise Etcher went on to make a synthesizer for video instruments. This was like
Wow. That's something.
1970, right?
Yeah.
1971. And Woody and Stana realized that that Soho, the area of Manhattan called Soho, needed a performance arts space. Now, what was going on back then is today we have the internet, and you and I can talk at long distances thanks
Right.
to the internet. But back in the 70s and before then, when artists wanted to network, they had to move into the same neighborhood. And
Oh, I love
in the
that.
50s, it was Greenwich Village, and in the late 60s to the early 80s, it was the area of Manhattan called Soho, until it became too expensive. But in the 70s, I had a loft in Soho in 1971,
Mm.
like 1,500 square feet for $180.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So in this area, you had choreographers like Yvonne Reyna and Trisha Brown. Uh, you'd have sculptors like Richard Serra, um, filmmakers,
Mm.
and composers like Philip Glass and Steve Wright, they all lived in this same area. So like um, a choreographer like Yvonne Rainer would show their piece in a loft, and the next day you go to the Puerto Rican breakfast place and see Richard Serra and Philip Glass talking about it over
How
breakfast.
about, wow.
And this is how the networking went back then. And so what Woody and Stainis realized is that, but Philip Glass would be performing music and changing parts and charging $5 at the door. It's in someone's loft.
Right.
It was basically their living room. And that's how he developed music and changing parts and music in 12 parts.
Right.
And Woody and Stainis thought, well, why don't we have a place that's more professional to play? And a place that just opened up called the Mercer Arts Center. And in it, there was like a theater for rock groups where the New York Dolls would play, theater groups where Richard Foreman would do his experimental pieces. And we had the old kitchen of the place, which we called the kitchen.
Oh, how about that? So
it was essentially it was a black box, and we could do anything with it. If you wanted a proscenium stage sort of thing, we had folding seats. If you wanted to be on the floor and surround the performer, it would work. And originally it was just for video. And you could surround the audience with video monitors, which someone like Nam June Paik would do. Wow. But Woody and Stainis wanted music in the place. And so I took them after that jam session with Daniel Nagrin. I took them to Mort's studio at NYU and showed them the Buchla synthesizer. And we really hit it off. Oh. And they said, listen, why don't we give you a video tape recorder? We have some images on it. You put some music on it. And so I started collaborating with them like that. And I was so excited because it was like 19, and we were showing it at Max's Kansas City, in the Epic where Walhar was there. And I was barely of drinking age. I didn't even know if I could get into there. But that was very exciting. And then they opened the kitchen and asked me to program a series of music there. And so I modeled the program. I was music director there from 71 to 73, and later from 77 to 1980. But in 71 to 73, I modeled my program on a very interesting series that was done at the Electric Circus, which was a place on St. Mark's between 2nd and Bowery. The facade of the building was electric blue, and the inside was like a cow's stomach that you could put, those, what's the name? Like a Joshua Light Show type thing. Except it wasn't Joshua who did the light show there. It was a light artist named Tony Martin. The two of them did very similar work. And every Monday they had an electronic music series there. So they'd have composers like 1 week it would be Robert Ashley, another week it would be Salvatore Martirano. Wow. And 1 week it was, I should tell you about this. It was, I'm going to do a parenthesis here.
That's okay.
But 1 week I went in and I saw a concert that changed my life. Wow. Like the back of the Wire magazines, it was an epiphany. I had 2 epiphanies in my life, but this was the first one. And I was a composer of European contemporary post-serial music, sounding exactly like Stockhausen and or doing the best I could anyway. Right. And at the time, if you were a young composer, you didn't want to be doing tonal music. You wanted to be doing something harsh and post-war, right? Or at least with a little bit of noise in it, right? And like John Cage would do. And so I went to hear this concert by this composer who I thought would be kind of noisy. And what I got when I got there was this hippie guy with red hair and multicolored pants playing electric organ. And to me, it sounded like circus music. And I thought, what is this?
Yeah.
I want my money back.
How about that?
And I went down to get my money, and they wouldn't give it to me.
Oh,
So I went back up and listened to the concert. And I said, this isn't so bad.
hmm.
And I listened to it more. And I said, this is really great. And the composer was Terry Riley.
Oh, wow. That's
And
great.
he
I
was
love his
playing
music.
A Rainbow in Curved Air,
Oh,
which
I
is
have that
his seminal
record.
piece for
Yeah.
electric organ.
Wow.
And then to cap it off, he and a composer named David Rosenboom played Poppy No Good's Phantom Band Live. That's a piece with two Revox tape recorders put about 20 feet apart, where
Oh,
the
okay.
sound of one tape recorder goes to the other, creating a feedback loop.
Oh, wow.
And so he was playing soprano saxophone, and instead of it sounding like one saxophone, it sounded like 100.
Oh my gosh. Wow. It must have sounded incredible.
Yeah, it was just incredible. And so I walked in there being a good little post-serial composer, and I walked out a confirmed minimalist. Although we didn't use the term minimalist back then, but whatever it was that Terry was doing, I liked it.
Wow.
And so that combined with the influence of Charlemagne Palestine and Eliane Radic firmly put me in the category of music of slowly evolving, long duration, which later became minimalism. So I modeled on the kitchen. I started out with asking my NYU friends to play
Right.
at the kitchen. We did a Monday night series. The first concert was with the composer Laurie Spiegel
Right.
on I think back then she was using an electro-comp synthesizer. And then we had many composers. It started out small, with maybe 10 people coming to the concerts,
Right.
and ended up with when Musica Electronica Viva played there, packing the place.
Wow.
And it became a very well-known series. And I left the kitchen because we all got tired, Woody, Stain, and I. We were doing it for free, and it's like a kind of public service, and we did our own things there.
Right.
But after doing that for 2 years, we were just tired, so we gave it over to somebody else who did a really good job. I came up in the world as a bartender.
How about that?
I was telling you about 2 bars up from CBGB's, but I didn't know about CBGB's at that time, of course. Okay. That came later. And that's
okay.
That's what I'm going to talk about now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I was, in the meantime, I started studying with LeMonte Young, who's he, along with Terry Riley, started the whole minimalist thing in the States. And he was very influenced by North Indian classical music. And his teacher was a fella named Pandit Pranath, an Indian guy, doing very beautiful music. And so Lamont studied with him, also Charlemagne, John Hassel, the trumpet player, studied with him.
Oh, okay.
And what we call him Guruji. What Guruji used to tell us, I studied with him also, what he told John Hassel was, don't do Indian music. Take what I'm teaching you, put it through a personal filter and make it your own. And that's exactly what John Hassel did with this collaboration with Brian Eno. I forget the name of their first album, but it was just gorgeous.
It is. Great album.
Yeah.
Love that album.
And you can hear Guruji's influence in John would half valve, on the trumpet, and get those in between notes that the Indian guys get. And so anyway, I ended up being a member of Lamont's group, the Theater of Eternal Music, and the group at the time was him and his wife Marianne Zazila. May she rest in peace. She just passed away recently. And Terry Riley would sit in whenever he was in town. John Hassel was playing trumpet, Garrett List on trombone. and Lenore Shue and I, who were students of LeMonte, were on voice along with LeMonte Marion.
Hmm.
And boy, were those sessions amazing.
That must have been.
Oh yeah, I'm
Huh.
not sure how much I can say on the air, so I'm going to watch my words. But we would ingest certain controlled substances before
Hmm.
the performances in the form of kind of put it in the honey and then eat
Oh,
it.
wow. Huh.
Yeah, and oh man, it was so powerful. And
Imagine.
and, and then we had to tune to these sine waves in perfect fifths. And the thing is that the ear can't posit. If the sine wave is at 440 cycles per second, for example, the cochlea, the nerves in the ear of the cochlea
Right.
can posit only 120. So it takes two of them or three, depending on the frequency, to gang up together to posit the frequency. And the way that interprets is in the brain is that the frequency appears to shift. And
Oh,
and
okay.
so
How about
so
that?
here I was trying.
Do that.
If you, the only way to get in tune is to listen to beat frequencies. Beat frequencies
Oh,
are
okay.
wow, 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 wow,
Like,
wow, wow. So I was a harpsichord tuner. That's how I made money before I was a bartender. And
how about
uh, uh, but after taking these controlled substances that LeMonte gave us, it was really quite an intense
I
experience. Put
imagine
it
must
down
have
to
been.
that. And so
Wow.
I look back. I don't want to make Lon sound like a drug fiend or anything like that.
No, no, no. That's just
He was just
enhances.
normal, but like a lot of musicians like to do things like that before they would play,
Right.
and especially jazz musicians, because that was Lamont's background as a saxophone player, and uh, so I was firmly doing music. It had shifted from Elian
Hmm.
and um, Charlemagne to doing music exactly like Lamont. And I said, I have to find my own voice. Like I was saying
Right.
earlier, like a trumpet player, as soon as you pick up the trumpet and it isn't classical music, they say, oh, it sounds like Miles.
Right.
And you
Right.
have to find your voice to make it sound like you.
Right.
And
Right.
a composer has the same thing. And I thought, wow, Lamont found his voice through Pandit Pranath, and merging the music that he did with this North Indian classical music. Steve Reich took music from Ganya, drumming
Oh,
music from Ganya, and mixed that into his pieces. Like his piece drumming was highly influenced by his experiences of studying with Ghanaian drummers. And with Phil, taking ideas that came out of the art world, of
right.
process art,
Hmm.
and working with the jazz instrumentation and jazz musicians, I said, like, what am I going to do?
Right.
And so you want to know what I did?
Sure.
I'll tell you. I'm glad you asked. Uh,
Sure.
uh, well, this composer had come to town, a group of composers who would study with Robert Ashley and David Behrman at Mills College, uh, named Peter Gordon.
Okay. I've
And
heard of it.
I was at the kitchen programming at the time. This was like in 1977, I think, or even 76. No, I wasn't even. I was a technician there at that time.
Wow. Huh.
I wanted to get out of bartending. The position of technician came up in 75, so I took it. And maybe I had just become director, and maybe it was 76. Must have been. Must have been. Uh, and Peter was doing something really strange.
Hmm.
He was mixing rock and roll with the classical techniques that he had learned with Robert Ashley. And I wasn't sure what I thought about it.
Hmm.
And so he asked me for a gig. We became friends because we were both friends with his wife at the time. And And so Peter was very smart. He said, he invited me to play in his orchestra, the Love of Life Orchestra.
Oh, right.
And at the time I was a flute player, so I was still playing flute. And I had never played in a rock band in my entire life because they had Ernie Brooks of the Modern Lovers on bass, David
Yeah.
Teagham on
Wow.
drums, and Arthur Russell was playing cello.
Oh.
And so I was thrilled to be in this group. Peter, I think,
Yeah, sounds
invited me. He invited me because he wanted to get a gig at the Kitchen.
Okay.
But whatever his intentions were, it worked.
Yeah, I'm sure. Right.
And so in playing in the orchestra, I thought, oh, this is really great. And so one day we were walking back home from rehearsal. We were rehearsing over at Westbeth, which had a lot of artist housing. It was over on the west side. And at the time, Soho had become too expensive, so I moved to the East Village. And Peter lived in the East Village also. And we're walking back from the west side, and Peter asked me a question while we were walking. He said, "Rhys?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Have you ever in your entire life been to a rock concert?" And I said, "Well, no. I admitted it. I mean, I had rock, I had the Grateful Dead at home, I had the Velvet Underground and Beatles, and but most of my collection was contemporary music. And he just laughed and he said, "Rhys, there's this really great club that opened up recently, and there's a very, very nice group that's playing tonight. Why don't you come? We'll go together." So this was May of 1976, and the place was CBGB's, and the group was the Ramones.
Oh, about that. Wow.
Yeah.
That must have been incredible.
Oh, man. Well, first of all, I'd never seen a rock concert in my entire life, and to be introduced to the Ramones, here are these like skinny guys up on stage with just guitars performing. And, I was wowed by the performance, of course, but, I listened to it and I said, this music is not unsimilar to the minimalist music that I'm doing. Now, their music was a bit more complex than what I was doing. They were playing with 3 chords, and I was only playing with 1. But I felt a lot in common. And I thought, well, maybe this is my path. That, if Steve worked with Ghanaian drummers, Phil worked with jazz instrumentation, Phil Glass, maybe I could work with guitars.
Yeah.
And so my friend Scott Johnson, I lucked out, was in the Love of Life Orchestra also, and he had just gotten a new Strat.
Oh, about that.
So he let me not have, but borrow for a long time his Telecaster, and showed me how to play bar chords and a simple blues scale, and that's how I got my start.
Oh, about that. Guitar. Wow.
And I started playing guitar. I never looked back. And, but I didn't want to be there were composers at the time who were like appropriating rock. And you'd hear statements from people here in France at IRCAM, for example, saying, "I'm taking the raw energy of rock and roll and putting it into my nice piece." And so what I realized very quickly was that I could make pieces with a rock and roll instrumentation and play it at places like the Kitchen and be a colonist in a way, or not a colonist, but just appropriating a music. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something that was more real and more authentic, if you like. And so what I decided to do was work with a rock instrumentation and with exclusively rock instrumentation and musicians, but not play it in art spaces because, I mean, I could play anything I wanted in art space and get away with it. I mean, LeMonte Young would do pieces like Feed a Piano, a Bale of Hay, and actually do it. And that was a piece. I mean, that
How
was
about
considered
that?
music, or Let a Butterfly Out
Right.
of the Jar. So, of course, I could play rock music at the kitchen and have it be considered classical music. But could I play the same pieces at CBGB's
Mm,
or at, I mean, that was the real question.
right,
Because
right.
now you were back there at the time, and you'll remember that the energy and the vibe in New York at that time was violent.
It was.
There was crack on the street.
Yeah, it
Now
was
you
crazy.
can't see it on the videotape, but I'm a
Right.
big guy, you know. You know, at the time I was a weightlifter, right? You know, so I wasn't exactly a frightened person walking down the street. But even me, you know, I'd look behind my back in the subway because there are
Yeah,
people
it was pretty.
crazy.
It was dangerous. It was.
Yeah, and you felt this energy in the music and in the punk scene back
Yep.
then. And you go to CBGBs, and the people, they'd be throwing beer cans at you with the beer in it, and that's if they liked you.
Right.
And so you
Right.
can imagine
Uh,
what happened
oh
if they
yeah.
didn't like you. Boring.
Uh,
And I loved the energy.
yeah.
It was very, very exciting.
Now we're
And
kind of running. We're kind of running out of time here. We got to do part two.
oh,
I,
okay.
I
Oh,
would
sorry
love to
about
do
that.
part.
What's our
That's
time limit?
okay. About an hour.
Oh,
About
okay.
an hour. But I
Sorry
would
about
love
that.
to do part two. No, that's fine. This has been fantastic. Are you available? Because there's so much more to go over. I would like
Oh,
to do part
are
two.
we at an hour already?
Yeah, almost.
Holy
That's
guacamole.
great. You
Oh,
really,
man.
it was
Oh, well,
fantastic.
we
The
should do
history,
part two
you
then, if you're up for it, if you'd like to.
absolutely. I mean, we haven't covered your guitar series and
We
your.
only just got up to the rock.
We got to do that tone deaf, and there's so much.
You know, we
Geez,
have to
this is
do you
fantastic.
have to do part two. So part
Absolutely
one was the classical part,
right.
and
And
part
this
two
part two
is
be your rock and roll era, your guitar era, and even playing with Liquid, right?
even
And
playing with
Lincoln
Liquid
Center.
Liquid. Not
That
once,
was
but twice.
fantastic.
Yeah.
So let's do this again soon, part two, and we'll keep this going. So it's been a pleasure. I really loved all the history. I mean, there's so much there. You were so lucky to be part of that era of so much experimentation
There
and
was so much going on. Yeah.
it, and we all experienced it. It was a vibrant era in New York. It really was.
Well, we'll get more into that in part two. So,
Okay.
folks, stay tuned for part two.
All right.
We'll be looking for you.
Okay, Reese. Great. We'll get to part two soon. Take care.